This is the second half of the multiplier video that hopefully you just watched. If you didn't see that one, I would watch the intro to the multipliers first. We left off on this screen here, and it shows how we're able to find our spending multipliers, the government spending, investment spending, and simple spending multipliers by taking the reciprocal or just flipping the MPS. Now, there's two other multipliers that you're responsible for. So there's three on the screen here, the spending multipliers. Then there's two other multipliers, which are the tax and transfer multipliers. Now, those are going to be slightly different, but you're going to find them almost the same way. You're just going to add one more step. Once again, if you check Module 16 or any of the materials we've given, you read the textbook or any of the other materials, there's going to be technical equations that can do this. I am kind of showing you a shortcut that will allow you to quickly get the multiplier and then do with the multiplier what you're supposed to do, which is multiply that by usually a change in spending to see what the total change in GDP, real GDP, is going to be. So if we go here on the next page, remember, you always have to keep in mind this concept, this MPC plus MPS equals 1. Okay, MPC plus MPS equals 1 is important because, as I said, they'll usually give you the MPC. And then they're expecting you to find the MPS. So we can assume that we did that, and all the way to the left, we have the different MPSs. Remember, I want you to think of these things as fractions. So if this is 0.1, that's 1/10, 0.2, 1/5, 1/4, 1/3, and 1/2. And so remember, you're just going to take the reciprocal. So all the spending multipliers, okay, we just kind of moving left to right here. We're going to just keep moving along. So that means this multiplier is going to be 10. All the spending multipliers, government spending, investment spending, simple spending multipliers, just taking the reciprocal. So hopefully you can just kind of see what's happening here. Now, if you're someone that doesn't need to think of it as a fraction, if you're just able to take 0.1, because the equation is 1 over the MPS. So if the MPS is 0.1, 1 over 0.1 is 10, okay? And 1 over 0.2 is 5. 1 over 0.25 is 4. So if you don't have to think of it in terms of a fraction, I just think for a lot of kids it's easier to think of the decimal in terms of fraction. But if you're able to go right from this column here, the MPS column, right to what the multipliers are, that's fine, okay? So now you have all your different spending multipliers. So whether it was business spending, whether it was just spending in general, or whether it was government spending, all those multipliers are going to be the same. The tax and transfer multiplier are going to be a little different. Let me actually just modify this here for a second. Okay, we're going to make it two different. Okay, tax and transfer. The difference between the tax and the transfer multiplier than the spending multipliers is the spending multipliers is direct. If you spend if a business spends, let's say $1,000, that $1,000 gets spent initially in the first round, and then it gets MPC'd and MPS'd from there as it keeps making its way into people's wallets and people's paychecks, and then their income becomes somebody else. They spend, and their spending becomes someone else's income, and it keeps going through the system. It's, as I said in the last video, it's sort of like a ripple effect. If you throw a rock into a pond, eventually it dissipates, but it keeps getting MPC'd and MPS'd each round through. So each round of spending gets slightly less due to MPC and MPS. Well, the tax and transfer multipliers are going to go through MPC and MPS before the initial change. So in other words, if a business spends $1,000, they spend $1,000, and then that money is going to be MPC'd, MPS'd from there. If I gave you, or the government gives you, a tax refund of $1,000, you don't spend all $1,000. In theory, you MPC, MPS that $1,000. So the first round of spending is always going to be less. Okay, it almost like it has to go through the filter of MPC, MPS before it's initially spent. If the government spends $1,000 on a bridge, that $1,000 gets spent, and then it gets MPC'd and MPS'd. If you give someone a transfer, Social Security payment, let's say, they MPC and MPS that before they spend it initially. Okay, so this is the tax and transfer multipliers are, as they would say, indirect. Now, you're going to basically find the tax and transfer multiplier the same way you found the spending multipliers. You're just going to make one change here. Each time you figure out what the spending multipliers are, the tax and transfer multiplier, because it gets MPC'd and MPS'd first, it's always just going to be one less. So if the spending multipliers are 10, the tax and transfer multipliers are 9. If this is 5, these two are just going to be 4. This is 4, these are 3, 3 is 2, and 2 is 1. So that's all you have to do. Now, technically, in your textbook, it might say this, and sometimes they focus on this. The spending multipliers and the transfer multipliers. So this column here and this column here tend to be directly related. If you increase spending or increase transfers, you increase real GDP. If you decrease spending and decrease transfers, you decrease real GDP. Tax is indirect. It's the opposite. If you raise taxes, you're going to lower real GDP because people have less money to spend. If you lower taxes, it's going to raise real GDP because people will have more disposable income to spend because you lowered their taxes. So the spending multipliers and the transfer multipliers are always considered positive. The tax multiplier, as a rule, is negative. And when you see it's negative, I almost don't want you to necessarily think of it in terms of like mathematically negative. It's almost like it's an opposite. If you lower taxes, real GDP goes up. If you raise taxes, real GDP in theory goes down when you're doing fiscal policy. Now, I'll mention this before, again, if you ever get a question, let's say the question says the MPS is 0.25. And they ask you what the tax multiplier is. So 125 is 1/4. You know most of your multipliers are 4. The tax and transfer multipliers are going to be 3 because that's 1 less. So if you're looking at like multiple choice questions, okay, and they ask you, the question is the MPS is 0.25. What's the tax multiplier? And you see these are your choices. If you see choices and you see that even though you know the tax multiplier is supposed to be negative, but they don't give you a negative choice, then just go with 3, okay? Because that's the absolute value is correct of the tax multiplier. If you ever get a scenario in which this happens, okay, then you want to make sure you're always selecting the negative answer. Okay, because technically the tax multiplier is negative. And so lately it seems like on some of the released exams or the practice exams, they focus more on the absolute value. They don't give you any negative choices. And so they're sort of just expecting you to know what the number is. But if you ever see both numbers there, select the negative option just for the tax multiplier. Remember, because the tax multiplier, as I said, is it has an opposite effect. So now what we got to just figure out is what we're really just trying to figure out is how much does the change in spending or change in taxes or transfers, how much does this equal a change in real GDP? And that's what the multiplier does. Okay, because the change in spending has a multiplied effect through the economy. It's not like $1,000 gets spent and that $1,000 gets run through a shredder. That $1,000 that's spent, it ends up in businesses' pockets and people's pockets, and then they in turn spend money too. So it's sort of an injection. So if they tell you, I'll just give you 2 quick scenarios here. If they tell you the MPC is 0.9, and then they ask you how much does $1 billion worth of spending, of government spending, how much would that impact real GDP? Okay, so we're trying to figure out what is the change in real GDP. That's what we're trying to solve here. Well, once again, if MPC is 0.1, they're telling you the MPS, or sorry, the MPC is 0.9. They're telling you the MPS must be 0.1 or 1/10. And that means all the spending multipliers are 10 in this scenario. The tax and transfer multipliers are going to be 1 less, so they're going to be 9. This is $1 billion of government spending. So you're going to use the government spending multiplier since they said it's government spending. Well, the spending multipliers are all 10. So you would take this billion, multiply it by 10, and your answer is going to be a $10 billion. And if this is more spending, so if this is an increase of $1 billion, then it's going to be an increase in $1 billion of real GDP. Okay? They do the same thing and they say people's taxes get raised by $1 billion. Well, now it's $1 billion. Let's use a different color. Tax increase. So what's going to be the change in real GDP? Well, look what happens here. If these multipliers are 10, the tax multiplier, in theory, is one less, so it's going to be 9, and technically it's negative. So this $1 billion increase times a negative 9 is going to mean GDP is going to go down by $9 billion. But if you just think about it, that makes sense. If you take more money from people by raising their taxes, so they have less disposable income, that's less spending that's going to be generated. And therefore, that is going to cause real GDP to decline. And that's really fiscal policy, doing government spending or changing taxes or a combination of both. Okay? So hopefully this video helped clear some of those things up. I'll just run through one more quick scenario on the next page. Let's say they told you that the MPC was 0.8 and they told you that there was a recession of $100 billion. Okay, there's a recessionary gap. So you're here, right? This is a recession, and that gap there is like $100 billion. And they say, well, what policies could you recommend? Well, if they tell you that MPC is 0.8, they're telling you the MPS is 0.2. That's 1/5. So the government spending multipliers are going to be 5. The tax and transfer multipliers in this case would be 4. So here's what you can do, okay? Because remember, it's always one less. So if you wanted to close a $100 billion gap and you want to do government spending, you know the multiplier is 5. So how much government spending would you have to do? Well, you're basically solving for X. You'd have to increase spending by 20 because multiplied by 5, that would get a change in real GDP. All right, this is real GDP over here. This is the amount of government spending, and this is your multiplier. Okay, so you could spend $20 billion times 5 gets you $100 billion. Or they might say, what would you have to do to taxes? Well, if the tax multiplier is 4, let's do it over here. And the multiplier and then the real GDP. So once again, we're trying to close a $100 billion gap. Well, we know the multiplier is going to be 4, so I know I'm going to have to cut taxes, because this is negative, cut taxes by $25 billion. 25 times 4 is 100, okay? And negative times a negative in this case would be a positive. So that would increase real GDP by 100 billion because you cut taxes, and vice versa. Okay, so hopefully this video helped clear some of that stuff out. If you do have, or some of that stuff up, if you have more questions about this, feel free to ask me in class.